Hello, everyone. Welcome. And thank you for joining us as we get to know the new Global Internal Audit Standards. My name is Kat Sales. I'm the Vice President, Standards and Guidance at IIA, and I will be your host for today's broadcast. But before we dive into the speakers and today's introductions, I will share some practical information with you. First, on the CPEs. In order to receive your full NASBA CPE credit, you must maintain your connection for at least 75 minutes and participate at least 70% of the attention checks that will pop up on your screen. Your CPE certificate will be emailed to you in approximately 60 business days. Now, should you experience any technical issues at any point, please press your F5 key or your Command R key if you're working on a Mac computer. That typically solves the issue. It is also recommended that you close all other programs on your computer, such as your email, your VPN, to ensure you have maximum bandwidth to view the webinar. If you would still continue to experience challenges, please let us know by sending us a message using the Q&A widget for technical assistance, and we will work in the background with you. We will also receive your questions via the Q&A widget, so don't hesitate to submit your questions during the session. So we invited for today's webinar 6 of our Audit Standards Board members. We have our chair here, Naohiro Mori. He currently serves the chair as chairman of the Standards Board. He's Japanese. And Mori-san is the Executive Vice President and Chief Auditor at AIG. He's the incoming chairman of the Audit Committee for the United Nations Office of Project Services. He previously served as the IIA chairman of the Global Board, and he was director at the IIA Japan. He's also past president of the Asian Confederation of Institutes of Internal Auditors. We also have here Mike Peppers, our vice chair. He's the immediate past chair of the Standards Board. He has been serving as a chairman from 2020 to 2023, so he was involved from the very beginning of the IPPF project. Mike is Chief Audit Executive for the University of Texas System. He is currently the IIA representative on the COSO board. And Mike has also served as an IIA Global Chairman and Chairman of the North American Board. Next, we also have Najib Fayyad. He is Chief Internal Audit Officer at Cinema Centers in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He's also a governor and past president of the IIA Lebanon. He previously was a board member and chairman of the Audit Committee of Arabia Insurance. Najib served for 6 years at the IIA International Relations Committee, and he also served now 6 years on our Standards Board. He was the Content Review Working Group leader for Domain 2, the introduction and the glossary, which he will present to you today. We also have Harriet Richardson, recently retired and the first Inspector General for the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District. She has more than 30 years of governing auditing experience, and Harriet has represented the Association of Local Government Auditors on several audit standard setting boards and councils. As an IIASB member, a Standards Board member, Harriet was the Content Review Working Group leader for Domain 5 and the sections on the public sector. We also have here Doron Ronon. He's a manager partner of Preston Risk Management Solutions, and he's the president of IIA Israel, where he also serves as the chair of the professional committee. He has more than 40 years of professional experience in internal audit, governance, risk management, and related specialties. He's also the past president of ISACA Israel. And as a Standards Board member, Doron was the Content Review Working Group lead for Domain 4. And last but not least, we have Dominique Vincenti. She is the Chief Audit Executive of Uber and has 30 years of experience in internal audit management, including with Nordstorm, Finca International, Marks & Spencer, and the Kering Group. She previously was a Chief Officer responsible for global professional and technical practices at the IIA Global. And as a Standards Board member, Dominique was the Content Review Working Group lead of Domains 1 and 3. So let's get started with today's agenda. Today you will learn something more about the governance and standard setting process of the IIASB, a very important process for which you will find much more information as well in the report that we published on our website. Our presenters will also discuss the stakeholder input that shaped the new standards, as we had the exposure period in the beginning of the previous year. You will also hear an overview of the IPPF evolution project, where we had some major milestones that we reached, but also we have some important ones still ahead of us. And as you know, we have a new structure for the IPPF as well as of the standards. So we will take another look at that, and then we will dive a bit deeper into the different domains. And then finally, we'll hear more about what is next. There's still some important things coming up for you internal audit practitioners, so we will tell you all what you can expect in the upcoming months and years. So welcome, Maurice-san. I will give the floor to you to talk us through the IPPF governance and standard setting process.
The standards are set for a profession to help our organization serve the public interest. As such, our global board mandated the International Internal Audit Standards Board, IIASB, to advise, direct, and approve standards with the IPPF Oversight Council to advise and oversee the process. The IIA global staff plays a crucial role in developing, managing, and marketing tasks with the Oversight Council and the IIASB. Our stakeholder groups, such as affiliates and chapters, IIA member volunteers, and direct and indirect stakeholders, also provide input and feedback. We have a similar structure for the Global Guidance Council. As stated, IIASB's mission is to develop, issue, maintain, and promote the standards as part of the International Professional Practices Framework, known as IPPF, for internal auditing to help organizations serve the public interest. The IIASB currently has 21 members from 18 countries, covering all continents, to achieve representation of our member body, with over 220,000 in 120 countries. We have selected our members based on their knowledge and experience in different countries, regions, industries, and sectors to have a balanced and holistic view of a profession. The Global Board established the IPPF Oversight Council in October 2010 to evaluate the due process for setting standards and guidance to promote inclusiveness and transparency, ultimately serving the public interest and increasing stakeholder confidence in the IIA standards. The Council has representation from 6 trustworthy global guidance setting bodies, including the World Bank, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD, the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, INTOSAI, International Federation of Accountants, IFAC, the Global Network of Director Institutes, GNDI, with the IIA representative.
Thank you, Maurice-san, for all the information on the due process. Now, also, we had the exposure period where we collected a lot of input from all the internal audit practitioners as well as from the external stakeholders. Can you tell us something more about that?
One of the things that was very important to us as we went through this process was that we received as much input as possible. So we did unprecedented global outreach to everyone who could give us insight. Members, affiliates, chapters, and external stakeholder groups, culminating in the 90-day public survey. This slide shows an overview of how some of that input came in and the responses were received. The Oversight Council and other standard-setting bodies told us they were very impressed with the level of response and engagement from these various constituent groups. You see, from the survey, we had over 1,600 responses. But from those 1,600, we got almost 19,000 answers or comments. We had more than 60 thoughtful letters. You see from the process report that someone looked at every single responses received. Those responses came not just from individuals, but also from groups representing hundreds of auditors. Importantly, in the last category, we held meetings around the world to talk to our stakeholder groups and get input from those who the standards will impact. We tried our best to develop the standards with as much input as possible. Regarding the specific responses, we were very pleased with the level of agreement that was communicated. Certainly, we did not expect 100% agreement with everything. But when our Oversight Council and those from other standard-setting bodies saw a percentage of strongly agree, and neutral in the high 70s and low 80s, it was considered very favorable. Although the Standards Board was encouraged by that, we still took very seriously all the input. So we closely reviewed the responses and took good ideas, whether they agreed or disagreed. The report on our process describes how the board utilized working groups of the board to analyze those comments. Even in areas that had high levels of agreement in the survey, we made some changes to provide an improved final product. You can find the report at the IIA.org, along with the new standards and other resources. In 2019, the IIA began this initiative that would later be called the IPPF Evolution Project. Mike Peppers chaired the IIASB during most of that project, and he will now share some highlights of that process and discuss the structure of the new standards that came from it.
Thank you, Morrison. Working on this project for the last 4 years has been one of the professional and personal highlights of my career. As I reflected on these milestones, I have to take a moment to thank everyone who had a part in this historic accomplishment. The Standards Board, the IIA staff, the Oversight Council, and so many of you around the world. The earliest days of the project were the year before the pandemic. We started research to take best practices from other standard-setting bodies. We held special sessions for various segments of our stakeholders, affiliates and chapters around the world, quality assessment performers, groups representing boards and governing bodies, and the IIA's principal partners. That led to enhancements in our due process, resulted in a new structure for the standards. And then, of course, we started writing. In early 2023, we did the most aggressive outreach ever to solicit feedback on the draft of that writing. Mori-san just shared some of those results with you. After honing and fine-tuning them over the last half of 2023, we reached the main milestone earlier this month with the release of the standards. The balance of this coming year will see the many translations, standards coming out in a digitally enhanced version that will have hot links to assist navigation, and of course, a print edition. 2025 will see the standards becoming effective in the transition for our certification exams. Now let's look at how that work resulted in the new structure and standards. The IPPF as we know it today, and as it's depicted on the left, has many elements. As we see its new depiction on the right, the standards themselves are now in 5 core domains, which I'll cover in a moment. You can see their relationship to the new concept of topical requirements that will coordinate with the domain of performing internal audit services. Then other global guidance will support users as they implement the standards and the topical requirements. One of the key things our research showed us was that users wanted a more clear and concise structure for the standards. We felt the entire work could best be organized into 5 domains: They are the purpose, ethics and professionalism, governing the function, managing the function, and performing internal audit services. We now have 15 principles that are spread through those 4 domains. Feedback has been very positive on having clear alignment of the principles and the standards. There are no longer designations of attribute or performance standards. Also, no distinctions of A's or C's, assurance or consulting. We felt the principles and standards should be the same regardless of the kind of engagement that it is. The standards themselves have 3 elements. First, there are the requirements, what most people would call the must statements, but we added 2 new elements. The considerations for implementation are common and preferred practices to consider when implementing the standards. The examples of evidence of conformance show ways to demonstrate that the required elements have been implemented. We'll talk more in a moment about the 3 additional features of the standards, 2 of which are new in this version. When we move away from the graphic, this slide lays out the 5 domains and their associated principles. I've often used this slide to show that we didn't change the profession. These concepts should look very familiar to all of us, but now they're organized in such a way that gives us structure and the ability to see everything at once. It was also a goal to make the standards more user-friendly by letting individuals go straight to the area that they need the most, either for a specific topic or perhaps based on their role. For example, Domain 3, governing, is a significant structural change, but we believe it will assist chief audit executives as they relate to their boards or governing bodies and senior management. You could literally put the principles and related standards of Domain 3 on one page to facilitate concise and focused conversations with those individuals. On the other end of the spectrum, though, a staff auditor could go directly to Domain 5 and access the standards most relevant to them as they perform their assigned engagement. I said earlier that we didn't change the profession that we all love, but we significantly changed the content, look, and feel of the IPPF. So much so that we changed the name to Global Internal Audit Standards. I do have somewhat of a personal appeal, though, that we not abbreviate them GIAS. That doesn't mean anything to anyone, doesn't even roll off the tongue very well. When we parenthetically note it, let's call them the standards. Every time we say or write standards instead of GIAS, we'll be reinforcing that we're an incredible, strong profession that conducts our work at the highest level.
So thank you, Mike, for giving us some more insights on the new structure of the IPPF and the standards. Now let's dive with our several IASB members now into the different domains, the principles and the standards, and starting with you, Mike, on the fundamentals part.
The current version of the IPPF opens with an introduction. Sometimes people read introductions, sometimes they don't. But in this new version, the Standards Board had several very important concepts or statements to make that we believe warranted upfront attention and which we named fundamentals. The first of those conveys 2 elements of the concept of public interest that Mori-san has previously mentioned. First, the Standards Board must set standards in the public interest. And second, the work that we do really supports our organizations as our organizations serve the public interest. Another fundamental is that although full conformance with the standards is certainly expected, the Standards Board recognizes that there may be exceptional circumstances in which full conformance is just not possible. In these exceptional circumstances, alternative actions should be implemented to meet the intent of the related standard. The Chief Audit Executive is responsible for documenting and conveying the rationale for that deviation and the adopted alternative actions to the appropriate parties. This section identifies the specific standards which have relevant details on this. As I said, standards and conformance is fully expected and required by all practitioners. However, we also acknowledge there are two significant types of practitioners for which there may be special considerations for conformance. For smaller internal audit functions, we've provided additional information in 3 of the standards that would be most impacted when performed by a small audit function. Also, the issues for those operating in the public sector are so unique that the Standards Board created a new section of the standards devoted to those internal audit functions. The section includes strategies for conformance which address their unique needs. Harriet Richardson, one of my Standards Board colleagues who has extensive experience in the public sector, will now talk a little further about the new section we added, which follows Domain 5 in the standards.
While the Global Internal Audit Standards apply to all internal audit functions, internal auditors in the public sector work in a political environment under governance, organizational, and funding structures that often differ from those of the private sector. This guidance on applying the Global Internal Audit Standards in the public sector describes situations in which the application of the standards may differ for internal auditors in the public sector. It includes guidance regarding laws and regulations, which acknowledge that the legal framework that internal auditors in the public sector work under may prevent full conformance with the standards. This guidance recognizes the conform or explain approach, which means that when conformance is not possible, the chief audit executive must document the reason, make appropriate disclosures, and conform with all other requirements of the standards. It references several standards where laws and regulations may prevent full conformance with the standards, including standards 4.1, conformance with Global Internal Audit Standards, 6.1, the Internal Audit Mandate, 6.2, Internal Audit Charter, 8.3, Quality, 12.1, Internal Quality Assessment, and 15.1, Final Engagement Communication. The public sector guidance recognizes that governance and organizational structures in the public sector may differ from the board and senior management framework described throughout the standards. It provides explanations and examples describing common governance and organizational structures in the public sector, as well as situations to be aware of and ideas for internal audit functions to adjust the application of certain standards while safeguarding independence. The third area discussed in this guidance is funding. It recognizes that the governance and organizational structures may affect how the internal audit function is funded. For example, some structures do not give the board and senior management authority over their budgets. Other structures may not provide the chief audit executive the ability to seek board approval of the internal audit function's budget allocation. And yet, in other structures, the chief audit executives in public sector may have limits on the way they may access and use resources. For example, there may be limits on how the internal audit function may spend its allocated funds. This guidance provides examples and situations to be aware of and ways to adapt.
Thank you, Mike and Harriet, for giving us some more insights in the fundamentals part as well as on the section of the public sector. Now let's dive into the glossary, and understanding how terms are used in the standards is essential for properly implementing the standards. Now, Najee, can you tell us something more on how this process worked on reviewing the glossary and give us some more insights in the new terms that are coming up?
The process of updating the glossary involved reviewing each term for its relevance, researching and comparing against other standards and frameworks, conducting initial surveys, and reviewing thousands of public comments. However, some of the things should be noted. As you can see on the slide, some terms have been retired or replaced with a new term. Many new terms also have been added, and as you can see, noting that the list is not a comprehensive one. In addition, improvements and clarifications have been made to the existing definition of some terms, such as the risk-related terms. Other examples include advisory services, which simply replaces the consulting services. But either term can still be used, of course. The board term also was expanded to include many types of governance structures in different countries. Terms such as condition, criteria, engagement, supervisor, finding, root cause, and other parts of the engagement process and reporting have been defined. It does not mean, however, that these are the only terms that can be used. We know for a fact that people might have different terms for the same thing, and that's okay. But these definitions allowed for the development of the domains where information was missing before. Other terms may be used elsewhere to mean the same thing.
Thank you, Naji. Now over to Dominique Vincenti. She was the working group lead for the Standards Board on Domain 1. Dominique, can you tell us something more about Domain 1, the purpose of internal auditing?
Domain 1, the purpose of internal auditing, provides a simple and concise overview of the essence of internal auditing. It's meant to easily communicate with your stakeholders. Think about it as an elevator pitch. Domain 1 starts with a purpose statement. Internal auditing strengthens the organization's ability to create, protect, and sustain value by providing the board and management with independent, risk-based, objective assurance, advice, insight, and foresight. The purpose statement combines elements of the current definition of internal auditing and the mission of internal auditing. You'll see on the slide on the left-hand side that the purpose includes a list of benefits from internal auditing. Internal auditing enhances the ability of the organization to successfully achieve organizational objectives, to help the organization strengthen its governance, risk management, and control processes, that the organization's decision-making and oversight ability will be better. With just these benefits so far, effective internal auditing surely contributes to what you see on the fourth bullets here, which is enhancing the organization's reputation and credibility with its stakeholders. Finally, the provision of objective assurance and advice strengthens the organization's ability to serve the public interest. And the purpose statements also include a list of conditions necessary to optimize such benefits. This is what you see in the right box. Conformance with the standards is emphasized as a necessary condition for optimizing the benefits of internal auditing, which means that the decision or action of a board or the chief audit executive that do not support conformance are choices for less than optimal benefits. Additionally, the first bullet of the right notes that global internal audit standards were established using a due process to ensure the consideration of input from external stakeholders is another great example of why those standards are serving the public interest. The second bullet recognizes that independence is presented as most effective when the internal audit function is directly accountable to its board. And finally, internal auditors must be free from and committed to making objective assessments in order for internal auditing to be effective.
Thank you, Dominique. Now moving back to Naji. He was the Standards Board Working Group lead for domain number 2, which is the ethics and professionalism.
Domain 2 brings together the existing code of ethics with what used to be called attribute standards in the 2017 standards, specifically objectivity, competency, and due professional care. We took this approach to simplify the structure of the IPPF, align with the elements, and remove duplication and inconsistency. The Standards Board researched, discussed, and considered each word of the existing code of ethics and what needed to be retained or changed just to ensure that the principles and the standards of ethics and professionalism are meaningful and relevant, yet remaining globally applicable. To give some highlights of Domain 2 principles, starting with Principle 1, demonstrate integrity, which consists of 3 standards. Standard 1.1, honesty and courage, brings a new emphasis on exercising professional courage as part of internal auditing, which is a vital attribute of every internal auditor's work. Standard 1.2, organizations' ethical expectations, requires internal auditors to encourage, respect, meet, and contribute to the legitimate and ethical expectations of the organization. Internal auditor also must encourage and promote an ethics-based culture and recognize and report behavior that is inconsistent with the organization's ethical expectations. How that is defined is intentionally kept broad because applicability will differ within each organization. Formally assessing and making recommendations to improve the organization's ethics-related objectives, policies, and processes is now a consideration for implementation, but not a requirement. Standard 1.3, legal and ethical behavior, is similar to the existing rule of conduct. It describes expectations around professional behavior, including not engaging in behaviors that are illegal or otherwise harmful or discreditable to the organization or the internal audit profession. Principle 2, maintain objectivity. Expectations relating to objectivity were consolidated from the Code of Ethics and various parts of the current standards into this group. The concept of objectivity is separated from that of independence and included in different domains, actually. Objectivity is part of domain 2, while independence appears in domain 3, governing the internal audit function, since it relates to the organizational status of the internal audit function. Standard 2.1, individual objectivity, identifies specific examples of potential biases and the requirement for the chief audit executive to support and promote objectivity by providing policies, procedures, and training. Standard 2.2, safeguarding objectivity, incorporates the assurance and consulting standards from the old Standards 1130 in the requirements section. Example of conflicts of interest and how the CAE can reduce the potential impairments of objectivity appear in the considerations for implementation to provide more clarity and detail. Standard 2.3, disclosing impairments of objectivity, describes the requirement for internal auditors, including the CAE, to disclose objectivity impairments. Moving to principle 3, demonstrate competency. Like in the 2017 standards, competency is an ethical principle in the new Global Internal Audit Standards. Standard 3.1, competency, combines the existing rules of conduct from the Code of Ethics with the existing standards 1200 and 1210 on proficiency. These were combined and simplified by just using the word competency and removing duplication. This standard recognizes that internal auditors provide a diverse array of services and that the competencies needed for these services vary widely. So basically, the requirements remain general. Internal auditors must possess or obtain the competencies suitable for their specific position, responsibilities, and level of experience. However, in the consideration for implementation, 9 areas of competency are recommended, along with suggestions on how to obtain it. This standard also calls out for the CAE responsibilities to ensure the internal audit function collectively possesses the necessary competencies to fulfill its mandate and achieve its plan. If not, the CAE must obtain the necessary competencies. Standard 3.2, continuing professional development, requires the internal auditors to maintain and continually develop their competencies and pursue the continuing professional development. The standard recognizes many ways to do that, including informal means such as on-the-job training. Principle 4, the existing standards on due professional care, which is the 2020 series, and the related expectations from the Code of Ethics were consolidated into this group with the new addition of professional skepticism. Standard 4.1 is based on the current Code of Ethics rule of conduct, which is 4.2, requiring internal auditors to perform services in conformance with the Global Internal Audit Standards. However, it now adds what to do in case of non-conformance. When internal auditors are unable to conform with the requirement, the CAE must document and communicate a description of the circumstance, alternative actions taken, and the impact of the action and the rationale. By doing this, the CAE provides information to support the external quality assessment, such that the internal audit function may be able to achieve conformance with the principle, even when conformance with the standard is not possible. Standard 4.2 brings the current standard 1220 implementation standards with .A's and the .C's, if you remember, describing the basic aspects that internal auditors must assess when providing their services. As for standard 4.3, it adds the concept of professional skepticism, which, by the way, was previously mentioned in the guidance, but not as a standard. And finally, in Principle 5, both standards clarify the concept of confidentiality from the existing Code of Ethics and expanded to more fully cover the care that internal auditors must exercise when handling the information to which they have access. Standard 4.1 and 5.2 are using languages that is more specific than the current Code of Ethics to describe types of confidential information and how it must be managed.
Thank you, Naji. Now, Dominique, you were also responsible as the working group lead for domain number 3. Can you tell us something more about domain number 3, which is the governing domain?
Domain 3 groups together standards involving the relationship between the chief audit executive, the board, and senior management in together governing the internal audit function. Many of these standards and concepts, you will recognize them as they exist in the 2017 standards, but way more details and directions are being given here, and it gives definitely some additional weight to the importance of establishing, supporting, and protecting the mandate, that is the authority and the role, and as well as the independence of the internal audit functions. The introduction to Domain 3 explains several concepts necessary for understanding the governance arrangements that enable an effective internal audit function, starting with a required dialogue between the chief audit executive, the board, and the senior management of their organization. While ultimately the chief audit executive is responsible for the requirements to be in place in this domain, appropriate governance arrangements supported by activities that are executed by the board and senior management are essential to enable the internal audit functions to be effective and to fulfill the purpose of internal auditing. So Domain 3 now has not only principles and standards for the chief audit executive, but display also essential conditions, meaning call-outs for the board and for senior management. Essential conditions, along with the requirements for the chief audit executive to establish a necessary foundation for an effective internal audit function. The essential conditions are intended to encourage and enable the board to establish the internal audit function, position it properly, meaning independently, and to oversee its performance. Senior management to support the board's intention and promote strong governance of the internal audit function. The introduction to Domain 3 also explains what the CAE may, should, and must do if the board and senior management do not fulfill or help fulfilling any of the essential conditions. Principle 6 is about the board authorizing the internal audit function through a mandate and providing the necessary support for this mandate to be carried out. Standard 6.1, internal audit mandate, the concept of authority, role, and responsibilities when combined here into one single word, mandate. This is a concept that captures the importance of the board's role in initially giving its authority to the internal audit function. The mandate is documented in the Internal Audit Charter, which is described in Standard 6.2, Internal Audit Charter, as a formal or codifying document that includes the mandate, along with other detailed specification about the function and the services it provides. Standard 6.3, Board and Senior Management Support. The CAE must provide the board and senior management with the information needed to support the internal audit function and promote its recognition throughout the organization. There are several essential conditions, including enabling the function to have unrestricted access to information, personnel, and physical properties. Having regular, direct communication between the board and the CAE. Having the board approve the internal audit charter, internal audit plan, budget, and resource plans. In Principle 7, the board's role in establishing and protecting the internal audit function independence is made very explicit. Standard 7.1, Organizational Independence. The requirements there describe the CAE's responsibility for documenting, reporting relationships, and organizational positioning of the internal audit function, as well as confirming the internal audit function's independence at least annually. This standard also describes the requirements for safeguarding independence when the CAE has roles beyond internal auditing. Standard 7.1 essential conditions describe attributes and practices of a direct reporting relationship between the chief audit executive and the board. Board approval and or participation in decisions regarding the CAE's appointment, removal, performance evaluation, and remuneration. The board providing the CAE with opportunities to discuss significant and sensitive matters, including meetings with that senior management present. The board requiring that the CAE is positioned at a level that enables freedom from interference, performing work, and provides sufficient authority and status. In Standard 7.2, Chief Audit Executive Qualification, the CAE must help the board understand their qualifications and competencies necessary to manage the internal audit function. Additionally, CAEs must maintain and enhance their own qualification and competencies to fulfill their roles and responsibilities. Principle 8 emphasizes the board's role in oversight of the internal audit functions to ensure the function's effectiveness. Standard 8.1, Board Interactions, requires the Chief Audit Executive to provide the board with the information it needs to conduct its oversight responsibility. The standard summarizes the CAE's required reporting to the board and senior management. Essential conditions there include the board and senior management helping to establish communication criteria and processes for escalating matters of importance. Standard 8.2, Resources, requires the CAE to evaluate whether internal audit resources are sufficient to fulfill its mandate and achieve the internal audit plan. If not, the CAE must develop a strategy to obtain sufficient resources and inform the board about the impact. In Standard 8.3, Quality, and 8.4, External Assessment of Conformance, the concept of quality is expanded to emphasize that quality equals conformance plus performance. Standard 8.3 requires the CAE to develop, implement, and maintain a quality assurance and improvement program that covers all aspects of the internal audit function. The program includes external and internal assessments. The CAE must communicate the results of those programs. The communication must describe the function's conformance with the standards and achievements of performance objectives. If applicable, compliance with laws and or regulations relevant to the internal audit function in that particular organization's industry or sector. And if applicable, plans to address the internal audit function deficiencies and opportunities for improvement. Note that the standard about internal quality assessment is in Domain 4, Standard 12.1. Standard 8.4 requires the CAE to develop a plan for external quality assessments and discuss the plan with the board. The external quality assessment must be performed at least once every 5 years by a qualified independent assessor. The requirements of this external quality assessment may be met through self-assessment with independent validation. The only required qualification is that at least one member of the team must hold an active certified internal audit credential. Other qualifications are recommended in the consideration section, but are not required. The considerations contains helpful details, though, about how to fulfill the requirement. Essential conditions describe the importance of the board review of the CAE's plan for the external assessment, as well as the board receipt of the results of the EQA directly from the assessor, and for overseeing external quality assessments and ensuring that they take place. Senior management should also review the EQA results and related action plans. Domain 3 makes a lot of references to standards that are actually covered in Domain 4. So it is very, very important that you consider Domain 3 and Domain 4 all together as you look at the responsibilities of the CAEs in governing the internal audit function and managing the internal audit function.
Thank you, Dominique. Now moving to Doron. He was responsible as a working group lead, standard board lead for the managing domain. Now, Doron, can you tell us something more about that?
Hi, everybody. In Domain 4, all principles and standards address the CAE, Chief Audit Executive, a term that's defined in the glossary and in the introduction to this domain as the leadership role responsible for effectively managing all aspects of internal audit function. The specific job title and responsibilities may vary. The standards in Domain 4 cover how the CAE plans strategically, manages resources, communicates effectively with the stakeholders, and enhances the internal audit function quality. So let's start with Principle 9, plan strategically. This principle requires the CAE to understand the internal audit mandate and the organization's processes. The principle also covers how the CAE plans and guides the internal audit function to fulfill its mandate and support the organization's success. So Standard 9.1, understanding GRC, governance, risk management, and control processes, as you know, aligns with the 2100 series of the current standards and require the CAE to understand the organization's key governance processes and high-level objectives and risk in key risk areas, and how the organization selects appropriate control processes. Standard 9.2, Internal Audit Strategy, is new. It did not appear as a requirement in the current standard. It requires the CAE to provide a vision, strategic objectives, and supporting initiative to guide the internal audit function. Establishing a strategy is a basic management process and important in planning for the internal audit function's future contributions and improvement. In other words, every organization manager needs or even must have strategy. The CAE is one of the organization manager. Moreover, we, the internal auditors, check that the organization and its managers have a strategy. Hence, we, the internal auditors, must lead by example. Talking about example, so for example, one approach to developing a strategy is to identify and analyze the internal audit function's SWOT. Another approach is to perform a gap analysis between the current and the desired state of the internal audit function. Standard 9.3 methodologies requires the CAE to establish policies, processes, and procedures to guide the internal audit function in a systematic and disciplined manner and provide internal auditors with training on the methodologies. The form, content, and the degree of detail and documentation of internal audit methodologies differ widely based on the size structure, and maturity of the internal audit function. So the requirements for this standard are general, while specific details about methodologies most likely to be necessary appear in the non-mandatory considerations for implementation. Standard 9.4 Internal Audit Plan incorporates the concept from current Standard 2010 and its implementation standards on risk-based planning and auditing, requiring the assessment of the organization's strategies, objectives, and risk at least annually to inform internal audit plan with the prioritized plan of engagement. Standard 9.5, the last one of this principle, coordination and reliance, is similar to the existing standard 2050, except that requires that the CAE to coordinate with internal and external providers of assurance services. Such coordination is often required by other standards and is beneficial because it minimizes duplication of efforts, as you know, highlights gaps in coverage of key risks, and enhances the overall value added by providers. This standard includes a sentence explaining a process for raising concern when attempts to coordinate are not reciprocated and an appropriate level of coordination cannot be achieved. Moving on to Principle 10. Principle 10, Managing Resources, addresses the CAE's role in managing financial, human, and technological resources to implement the internal audit function strategy and achieve its plan and mandate. This principle, number 10, and its standard are connected to Standard 8.2, Resources in Domain 3 that was talked about earlier. Standard 10.1, Financial Resources Management, requires the CAE to develop a budget that enable the successful completion of the internal audit plan, which must then be presented to the board for approval. Presented for approval. The CAE is required to seek budget approval from the board, but board approval of the budget is not required since the process is often beyond the control of the CAE. That's why we stated presented to the board for approval. Standard 10.2 HR Management carries forward existing Standard 2030 Resource Management, which requires the CAE to ensure that internal audit resources are appropriate, sufficient, and effectively deployed to achieve the internal audit plan. You know that. This standard adds the requirement for the CAE to establish an approach to recruit, develop, retain qualified internal auditors, and a CAE responsibility for evaluating internal auditors' competencies and encouraging professional development. The considerations for implementation section add ideas for fulfilling these requirements. Standard 10.3 Technological Resources states that the CAE must regularly evaluate the technology used by the internal audit function and strive to ensure, not ensure, strive to ensure the function has technology to support the audit processes and that auditors are properly trained on the technology. Principle 11, Communicate Effectively, expresses the CAE's responsibility for various types of communication by the internal audit function. Standard 11.1, Building Relationship and Communicating with Stakeholders, requires the CAE to develop an approach for the internal audit function to build relationships and trust through formal and informal communications. 11.2 requires the CAE to establish and implement methodologies to promote effective communication based on the current standard 2420. That means accurate, objective, clear, concise, constructive, complete, and timely. You know all that. 11.3, Communicating Results, identified 3 types of internal audit services results: engagement conclusions, themes, and conclusions at the level of the business unit or organization. Theme is a new term for the standards. It's a concept that refer to the CAE's communication of results beyond just a single engagement. The term overall opinion used in the current 2450 standard is essentially replaced by a broader concept of conclusions at the level of the business unit or organization. The changes were made to more broadly reflect the types of communication that the CAE delivers. This standard, plus standards 11.4 and 5, state the CAE's responsibilities related to communicating engagement result and final engagement communications. So standard 11.4 error and emissions, based on the existing standard 2421, states the CAE's responsibility for communicating corrected information if a final engagement communication contains a significant error or omission. The criteria for determining significance are agreed upon with the board. And then standard 11.5, communicating the acceptance of risk based on the existing 2600 standards, the famous one, describes the CAE's communication responsibilities when the CAE concludes the management has accepted a level of risk that exceeds the organization's risk appetites or risk tolerance as understood by the CAE to the board. The considerations for implementation give example of an approach to this standard and of the impacts that may result from risks that exceed the risk appetite. And the last principle for this domain, principle number 12, enhanced quality. Standard 12.1 covers internal quality assessment, the CAE's responsibility for the internal audit function, conformance with the standards, and continuous performance improvement. Internal quality assessments consist of the same parts as are required in the current standards, ongoing monitoring and periodic self-assessments. Quality is described as including conformance and performance components. That means quality equals conformance plus performance. Standard 12.2, performance measurement. On a personal note, this is my favorite standard. I like this standard because it goes right into the heart of internal audit. It goes beyond the technical parts of conformance to the standard and diving in the essence of our profession. In other words, it deals with the substantive, not just compliance. The standard requires the CAE to develop objectives and a methodology to evaluate the internal audit function performance, along with action plans to address issues and opportunities for improvement. This standard raises expectations for the internal audit function's quality to be more than just conformance with the standards, showing also an intentional focus on performance measurement. The considerations for implementation describe broad categories and gives 11 examples of performance measures that you can choose from. Standard 12.3, the last for this domain, ensuring and improving engagement performance, requires the CAE to establish and implement methodologies for engagement supervision, quality assurance, and development of competencies. It acknowledges that supervisory responsibilities may be delegated, but that the CAE retains ultimate responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Doron. Now, back to Harriet. Harriet, besides the public sector domain, you were also responsible for the domain 5, which is the managing of the internal audit services. Can you tell us something more about that?
Domain 5 includes the standards for planning, performing, and communicating engagement results. The standards, requirements, and considerations for implementation in this domain are applicable to both assurance and advisory services, unless otherwise specified in individual standards. The reason for this was to present a consistent, generalized approach to project management that identifies the fundamental elements of planning, performing, and communicating each engagement. Although there aren't separate assurance and consulting standards, the Standards Board Working Group added or modified language throughout Domain 5 to clarify when requirements may not apply to advisory services. The principles in Domain 5 cover engagement planning, field work, developing and reporting findings, developing recommendations and/or action plans, and following up on management's corrective actions. So let's take a closer look at the contents and noteworthy changes in this domain, starting with Principle 13, Plan Engagements Effectively. Standard 13.1, Engagement Communication, is intended to emphasize the importance of communication throughout the engagement. The requirements are not much more than what is required in the 2017 standards. The types, quality, and content of engagement communications may vary by the type of engagement and should be determined by the Chief Audit Executive based on the expectations of the board and senior management. Initial, ongoing, closing, and final communications are common stages of engagement communication. They are described in the considerations but are not required. The method of communication may also vary based on the engagement and may include informal and formal communications, as well as written or oral communications. Standard 13.2 describes the engagement risk assessment, which leads to refinement of the engagement objectives and scope, which are described in Standard 13.3. The engagement objectives articulate the purpose of the engagement and the specific goals to be achieved, including those mandated by laws and regulations. The risk assessment is an example of a standard that may not be applicable to an advisory engagement. Standard 13.4, Evaluation Criteria, states that internal auditors must use the most relevant criteria to evaluate activities under review for the engagement. If management has established criteria that internal auditors deem adequate, that criteria must be used. If such criteria has not been established, internal auditors must identify and apply reasonable criteria through discussion with the board and/or senior management, and should encourage management to adopt that criteria for the future. Standards 13.2 and 13.4 include examples of elevating requirements from existing implementation standards for assurance to apply to all engagements. Standard 13.5, Engagement Resources, states that internal auditors must determine the financial, human, and technological resources needed for engagements and discuss with the Chief Audit Executive any concerns they have regarding the lack of sufficient resources to achieve the engagement objectives. The standards in Principle 13 culminate in the Engagement Work Program, which reflects the results of planning and guides the fieldwork. The requirements for what must be included in engagement work programs are described in Standard 13.6. So moving on to Principle 14. Principle 14 contains standards about the steps for conducting engagement work, including details on analysis and evaluation, which simply aren't discussed in the 2017 standards. Whereas the 2017 standard 2320 has one sentence about analysis and evaluation, the 2024 standards break down the common activities in this process in a step-by-step approach. Standard 14.1 describes steps for obtaining and analyzing data in comparison to the evaluation criteria, including ensuring that information collected is reliable, relevant, and sufficient. Standard 14.2 contains requirements for determining potential engagement findings. Finding is a new term for the standards and is defined as a gap between the evaluation criteria and the condition of the activity under review. For advisory services, this process may differ or be unnecessary. Standard 14.3 requires internal auditors to evaluate each potential finding to determine its significance and to collaborate with management to determine the root causes if possible. This standard requires that when internal auditors determine there is a significant risk exposure, it must be documented and communicated as a finding. The considerations for implementation discuss methods for determining and communicating the significance of the findings for the benefit of the audit's stakeholders. Ratings and rankings are not required, but are cited in the considerations for implementation as examples of how prioritization may be demonstrated. Standard 14.4, Recommendations and Action Plans, requires internal auditors to determine whether to develop recommendations related to findings, or to request action plans from management, or to collaborate with management to agree on actions. These options recognize the varied approaches that different organizations may have regarding recommendations and action plans. Standard 14.5, Developing Engagement Conclusions, requires internal auditors to summarize the engagement results relative to the engagement objectives, and requires the inclusion of internal auditors' professional judgment about the overall significance of the findings when aggregated. It allows the chief audit executive to determine the approach for doing this. It also has a specific requirement for assurance engagements to include a judgment on the effectiveness of the governance, risk management, and control processes of the activity under review. Standard 14.6, Documenting Engagements, establishes requirements for documenting the support for conclusions in a manner that would allow an informed internal auditor or similarly informed person to repeat the work and achieve the same results. So moving on to Principle 15. Principle 15 describes the special details of communicating at the end of an engagement and after an engagement has concluded. Standard 15.1, Final Engagement Communication, requires including the engagement objectives, scope, recommendations, and/or action plans, if applicable, and conclusions. If the engagement was not conducted in conformance with the Global Internal Audit Standards, this must be disclosed in the report. Standard 15.2, Confirming the Implementation of Action Plans, requires internal auditors to confirm that management has implemented recommendations or action plans, and requires certain steps based on consideration of the significance of the finding. It also requires the chief audit executive to determine if senior management's delay or inaction means they have accepted a risk that exceeds the risk tolerance.
Thank you, Harriet. Now, what is next? Obviously, the new standards impact a lot of our other projects here at the IIA. We have the topical requirements coming up. As already mentioned, the topical requirements will be that third mandatory part of the IPPF framework. The quality assessment will be impacted. We give you some more information on that. The certifications as well, not only in terms of the exams, but also in terms of the training materials. And we will still continue to provide you with additional resources. So we invite you to regularly check our website on the diia.org/IPPF evolution webpage. So then the topical requirements. The topical requirements will be that third new element of the IPPF framework. They are mandatory requirements for specific risk areas that we will develop. They will give you some more requirements and explanations on how to cover aspects in governance, risk management, and control in that specific risk area. There will be considerations as well as some guidance. Now, why these topical requirements? Well, the two main reasons is, first of all, the quality. We want to ensure that there is a minimum level of quality in these often quite specific and complex risk domains. And then the second one is coherence. We want to make sure that throughout the world, people audit these risk areas in the same coherent manner. So we have currently some topics on the table that might be developed in the near future. And the first one is cybersecurity. This one will probably be a pilot that will be launched later on this year. Some other topics might be IT technology governance, fraud risk management, third-party risk, and ESG. More on that in the near future. And then the external quality assessments. As you know, the standards will become applicable in the beginning of 2025. So actually, there are two scenarios now on the table. If your EQA is due for this year, 2024, you can still be assessed against the current standards, the 2017 version. Or you can opt to be assessed against the new Global Internal Audit Standards. Now, if your EQA is due next year in 2025, then the new standards will be applicable. There you have an option. You can accelerate your EQA to still be assessed against the current 2017 version, or you can opt for being assessed against the new Global Internal Audit Standards. Now, whatever option you take when it is due for this year or for next year, we strongly advise you, if you opt to be still assessed against the 2017 version, to do a kind of readiness assessment, a gap analysis, to make sure that you are prepared for implementing by the beginning of next year. Now, what about the changes in the examinations of the IIA credentials? The CIA will change, the content will change, the exams will change, but you should not expect those changes in the exams before May 2025. Also, for the auditors who are in the running for their certificate, there will be a transition period and more information on that to come. We will update the study materials, but that also will not be before March 2025. The internal audit practitioner exam and study materials will also be updated, but there will no changes before the effective date of the new standards. The CRMA, our third certificate, will not be affected because this one is mainly about risk management. But I do invite you, if you have questions about the certifications, to visit our website on theiia.org/CIA 2025. So handing it back to you, Maurice-san.
I'd like to thank Mike, Kat, Dominic, Naji, Doron, and Harriet for their insights today. We trust that this webinar has fulfilled its objectives to acclimate you to the new global internal audit standards. Mike and I will answer some of the questions you have been submitting during the webinar, but we're not stopping here. The IIA will deliver future webinars on other related topics, like next month on the quality assessment process. New training courses will be added, and you will also see special workshops and sessions at upcoming conferences. Please avail yourself of these opportunities. Now let's look at some of your questions.